right, so we are still doing exaggerations, half-truths, and bald-faced lies, looking at lies because a lie was a tool of the enemy that he used to deceive Eve in the garden, getting her to exchange the absolute freedom that she already had for the bondage that he had to offer. So she gave up peace and contentment and satisfaction and joy for stress and anxiety, fear, worry, doubt, all of those negative things. She exchanged the great for the not so great, for the terrible, actually. And as we study, we are every week being very careful to purposefully examine our own heart, our own lives, to see that we don't remain blind to any lies that we have already bought into, any lies that we've already believed. So we're asking ourselves a question. Not do I believe this lie, but do I live as though I believe this lie? Because if our first response is, oh, I know better, or I know what the word says, or I know the truth, that's not enough. We have to look and see what our behavior indicates, because this is our great example. We use it every week. We can say, God's bigger, God's stronger, God's more powerful. I trust God. But if we worry, then we don't really believe God's bigger or stronger or more powerful. We don't trust God if we worry. So we're looking at the action, not necessarily what we say we believe. And so right now we are studying, or looking at rather, lies about our faith. The enemy is constantly whispering lies into our heart about our faith in order to limit and restrict and hinder our growth. He does not want you to put your full confidence in God. He does not want you to put your faith or your trust in His Word or in God's principles. He doesn't want you to understand the power of prayer and how prayer really does change your circumstance and your situation. He does not want you to understand the impact or the force of the principle of God's Word in your life. He does not want you to connect with the reality of God's presence in your life, because if you do, then He understands that you are going to be a force to be reckoned with. He understands that if you do those things, you're going to grow some deep roots, and you're going to be unmovable and unstoppable. You're going to be unshakable. So He will constantly whisper lies in your ear about these things in order to keep you from digging in. So a couple of the lies about your faith that we've already debunked is, the first one was number 16, that the Bible is not completely true or accurate. We've already resolved that. Lie number 17 is, I can make it without daily prayer and Bible study. And we debunked that and saw that that's not true. We can't. We can barely survive, much less thrive, if we're not in the Word every day, if we are not talking to God every day. We just finished with, 2 weeks ago, the lie that God doesn't hear my prayers, or my prayers are not effective, or prayer doesn't work, or any variation of that lie. We looked at that and we completely debunked that and grasped hold of that truth. And so tonight I want to look at lie number 19. And that is the lie that God is not speaking today, or God isn't speaking to me, or God only speaks to certain people, or any variation of the lie that would have to do with God talking directly to you. The enemy would love for you to think that God is not speaking anymore. Now remember, we're talking about lies that the enemy tells the women of God. And this lie is pretty prevalent in the body of Christ, that God is no longer speaking to us today. He suggests to us that the voice of God only was experienced by those who lived in the Bible. He whispers that this type of thing just doesn't happen anymore. God's just not speaking anymore. He implies that God spoke to humans before the Bible was written, but at the completion of the Bible, God stopped talking, and He isn't saying anything to anyone. Or He may give you a variation of that and say, oh yes, well, God does speak to some people, but you've got to be a special person for that. Maybe you've got to have a special gift or a special calling like a pastor or a missionary, or you've just got to be a very spiritual person in order to hear God's voice. But the truth is that God does speak, and God is speaking today. From the very beginning, God's desire has always been to have an intimate, personal relationship with every single individual human. An intimate relationship is only produced by being in close proximity with another person and then communication with them, right? And communication on both sides. And we see that throughout the Word. When we look at the Bible from Genesis, when God came down from heaven and walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day, all the way through the Bible to Revelation, where God gave John this magnificent vision, we see that God's heart has been to communicate with humans, to talk with humans, and nothing has changed. We can't find anything in the Word that would indicate that God isn't speaking to humans today. In fact, we find exactly the opposite. Let's go to John chapter 10, verses 3 through 5. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And after he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger. They will run from him because they don't know his voice. In this passage, this is what we see, that God is speaking. Because it says the sheep, what? Know his voice, recognize his voice. In order for them to recognize his voice or hear or know his voice, what has to happen? He has to speak. The other thing that we see through that is that he's calling his sheep by name. That means he knows each individual sheep's name. And if he's calling the sheep by name, that means he's speaking to the individual sheep, right? So this passage shows us that God is speaking, and God is speaking to us personally. Not that he necessarily is. He can speak to us through someone else. Okay, I don't want to diminish that. But God's primary way of speaking to us is individually. It's personally. I mean, let's think about this, okay? Because we're always talking about our relationship with God mimicking our human relationships, right? Because a relationship is a relationship. And the dynamics of a relationship pretty much work the same way. So how weird would it be for you to have a friend who never, ever spoke to you? Yeah, as Mindy says, they wouldn't really be a friend. That would be super weird, wouldn't it? I mean, like, if that's how it worked, then I could say to you that Queen Elizabeth and I are friends. I know her. I know where she lives. I know where her house is. I know a lot of things about her personal life. And you must really be close because you know her birthday. April 21st. See, I didn't know that. I'm not as close as you are. And I email her all the time. I write letters. I tweet her. I'm friends on Facebook, for Pete's sakes. But you know what's weird about that is I'm the only one that's ever doing the communicating. I'm the only one ever reaching out. There's no reciprocation there, so therefore it's kind of a shoddy friendship, don't you think? And if you've got a person who's right, like, you know, let's say Debbie. Debbie and I are friends, but Debbie never calls me. When she sees me, she might look at me, and I'll talk to her, but she never responds. She never says anything. It's always me calling her, always me emailing her. I'm always sending her a card. I'm always Facebooking her. I'm always coming out to her, but she never reciprocates in any way. I'm going to get tired of that. It's going to be a pretty boring relationship, don't you think? And because of that, at some point, I'm going to say, yeah, I love you, Debbie, but gosh, I'm so tired. I'm propping this whole thing up by myself. And I'm just going to get kind of lazy about calling her and talking to her because there's nothing that's coming back to me. And that's exactly how I view our relationship with God. I mean, don't you think it would be crazy that the one who initiated the relationship with us, okay, because I didn't go to him, he came to me. He drew me. He offered me all of himself. And at my acceptance of him, then he immediately stops communicating with me. It would almost seem like then I become a notch on his belt or a token on his shelf if he ceases to speak with me. Does it make any sense that he would start the relationship, and once I entered in, now it was my responsibility to make the relationship work? It's my responsibility to always go to him, to always carry the conversation. Does that make any sense to you? Does it make sense that the Bible says that we're not even wired to govern our own life? And he likens us to sheep, which are the dumbest animals on the face of the earth. And yet he expects me to facilitate and run a relationship with the greatest mind of the universe. Does that even make any sense? That doesn't make any sense at all. Does it make sense that someone who gave up everything to give me a gift would stop speaking to me when I accepted the gift? Does it make sense that God would speak to us but make it so complicated and so difficult that we really can't discern what we're hearing or even know that it's him? Does any of that make sense to you? You see, none of that makes sense to me. None of it. And I think about the passage in Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 17, where it says, God is rejoicing over us with singing. And I think about that passage, and it seems to me that if God is singing to me, wouldn't he want me to hear it? And the word rejoice means to wildly celebrate. And a part of the wild celebration in that definition is exuberant dancing. So he is dancing because his heart is so full of wild love for me, and he's singing a love song to me, but yet he doesn't want me to hear that or see that. Does that make any sense to you? I mean, again, let's put this in the context of a relationship. Let's just say that I'm inside my house, and Bill is outside the house in the yard, and he is so in love with me, and y'all know he is, that he is wildly dancing in the yard, singing to the top of his lungs a love song to me, okay? And somebody has to come inside and tell me, by the way, I thought you might want to know that Bill's in the yard dancing for you and singing a love song to you. Right. I mean, how weird would that be? You know, and would my response be, oh, well, how nice? And I just stay in the yard, completely dependent upon someone else to tell me that that's how Bill feels about me. That's kind of ludicrous, isn't it? I mean, even as I'm saying that, y'all are thinking that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. If that was happening, the moment somebody told me, I'd have to go to the window. I'd have to get outside so that I could feel, so that I could hear, so that I could see his expression of love for me. And God is no different. If he is singing over you a love song of his passionate devotion for you, he wants you to hear it. If he is wildly dancing over your life because he loves you so deeply and passionately, he wants you to see it. Because if you connect with that, it just draws you deeper into a relationship with him. God is interested in us seeing and hearing him. However, for some of us, the idea of God personally talking with us as an individual, as a regular, everyday, ordinary, very common woman can be a little bit scary. In fact, it's probably just downright uncomfortable for us. We even, we just get nervous, some of us do, with the idea of God speaking directly to us. Some of us even get uncomfortable when someone tells us that God spoke to them. Not that he spoke to, we're not talking about him speaking to me, but you know what God showed me in a dream? Do you know what God said to me? Do you know what I heard this morning? And they start talking about that, and we get kind of, oh, yeah, really? That's interesting. And I kind of understand that. Society kind of pushes some preconceived notions on us about that, because we've all seen the unbalanced person on the news who claims that they did this heinous crime because God told them to. We've all seen that, and we're kind of afraid of that. Or maybe we've experienced a situation where someone was attempting to manipulate or gain favor by saying to them, God told me something. Or maybe you do feel like God spoke to you at one point, and then you stepped out to do whatever you felt like you were being told to do, and it didn't work out so good. I think most of us have probably been there. I'll be the first one to raise my hand on that. And so now you're scared to say that you heard from God. You're scared to misquote God. You're scared to step out in that. Or maybe you think you're just going to sound like a complete flake. Overly spiritual, too saved, if you start saying that God's speaking to you. And I can understand that too. I mean, I kind of put myself in some people's shoes. Like, for example, I'm sure Balaam probably felt that way when he went to tell his friends and family that God spoke to him through a donkey. Y'all know that story? In Numbers chapter 22, Balaam, why didn't you do what you said you were going to do? Well, you see, it's like this. I was on my way, and then my donkey started speaking. How crazy is that? Or maybe Noah felt very nervous at saying, you know what, God's told me to build a ship in this landlocked area because a flood is coming, because it's going to rain, and it had never rained before, ever, prior to the flood. So that sounded kind of crazy. Or maybe you felt really insecure like Gideon did when he was telling everybody, God's telling me to send you boys home because we're fixing to fight this battle against the nation of Midian, and I only want 300 of you to stay. That sounds kind of insane, don't you think? Or maybe you would feel like Mary, who had to tell everybody, folks, I just want you to know I'm pregnant. I'm a virgin, but I'm pregnant. And God told me that through an angel. You got to feel like you might be on the verge of insanity with that one. Or maybe you're trying to explain to people what's happened to you when you were Paul, blinded on the road to Damascus. And everybody else is just seeing you talk to thin air while you are blinded by a light and distinctly hearing the voice of Jesus. Or you're like Paul and you completely change all your travel plans because you had a dream. So, for us, we hear those stories and we hear those experiences, and we think, well, that sounds pretty normal to me, because they're in the Bible, and we've already established the fact that everything in the Bible is true. And so I'm okay with those stories. I'm comfortable with those stories, and it's easy for us to say that on this side of it. But for them, in the middle of it, without a Bible to fall back on to see that that's normal or that was expected or those kind of things could happen, I'm pretty sure for them they were very uncomfortable, very nervous about explaining that to some people. They knew what they experienced, but trying to get somebody else to relate to that is a completely different story. So there's a lot of different reasons why we can feel uncomfortable with the idea of God speaking directly to us as a human, as an individual. And with that nervousness in mind, I kind of want to talk about how we can hear from God, how we can know that God is actually speaking to us, and what that might sound like or look like, and then kind of delve into some steps that we can take in order to start the ball rolling and us hearing from God. Because I know that some of you in the room do hear from God, but you might feel like it's an every once in a while occasion. And some of you may never have heard from God. But I want you to know that talking with God is an everyday thing. Not just me speaking, but him actually speaking to me, where I hear or see something. And if anybody tells you that that's not how it works, well, I respectfully say, bless their little heart, because that's not how it works. We're in a relationship, and in relationships, people communicate with one another. God is speaking to us. We just need to get on that frequency and tune in. So let's talk about how we can do that. Now, the first thing that we do need to understand is that we have to come to him or live with the expectation of him speaking. If I don't think he's speaking, then I am not listening. Right? If I don't think he's going to talk, then I'm not going to be prepared to hear. I'm not going to be tuned into his voice. You know, think about it from this perspective. If I go to Walmart by myself, then I'm not listening for anybody else's voice. It's just me. But when my kids were little and I went to Walmart with my kids, man, that mom tuner was on, right? And so I was listening, and you know how that is, because you know your kid's voice different from everybody else's voice, right? Those kids sound different from every other kid. Their sneeze, their cough, their laugh is different and unique, and you're tuned into that. Another kid could scream their head off, and you don't even move. Your kid screams, man, you're right there, because you know your child is there, and you're listening. You're aware that they could be making a sound, and you are tuned into that. And we need to be the same way with God. We need to live with the expectation that God is speaking to me. God is speaking to me every single day. And I have to be prepared and aware of that possibility, expecting it, not just hoping that he might stop by today, but understanding that I'm living in the presence of God 24/7, and he is speaking. Am I going to tune in and listen? The next thing we have to be aware of is that, I keep saying this and I'll always go back to it, is we're in a relationship. We are in a relationship, and communication is a vital part of any dynamic, growing, healthy, thriving relationship. But communication has to be developed. You know, we think that communication just comes super easy and it's just, you know, we just talk and that's just how it is. But that's not true. Communication is a skill that must be developed. And so I think about when I met Bill. I had to be very purposeful in learning how to communicate with Bill. Yes, some things he said and I understood pretty clearly, okay? But other times the message was muddled. It didn't make sense to me. I completely misunderstood what he said because we spoke two different languages. He spoke boy and I spoke girl. And those are two totally different languages. Isn't that true? And our personalities were different. They still are different. Our life experiences were different. So some things meant something to him that didn't mean that to me. Our upbringing was different. Our geographical locations were different. So we had different lingo. We had different colloquialisms. We had different ways of speaking. And all of those things affected our communication. So I had to learn Bill. I had to learn his mannerisms. I had to learn his facial expressions to know that meant he did not like that, or, oh, he really thought that was funny, or he liked whatever it was I just said. I had to learn to read his body language correctly. I had to learn his mannerisms. I had to interpret his lingo. I had to understand his personality. I had to begin to understand what was important to him. I had to understand how his thought processes worked. I had to understand that there were certain times to share pertinent information, and there were times that Kim just needed to be quiet. I had to learn all of those things. So I went into training and I began to study him. And today I have a master's degree in Kim Wahl. And I'm currently working on my doctorate. And the point of that is that communication happened between the two of us on purpose. Because I determined not just to listen for him, but understand what I was hearing, to actually hear what he is saying. So with that in mind, I think the same thing is true for God. It's a skill that we have to develop. We have to be very intentional about developing that skill, that ability to actually hear him. Because sometimes God speaks to us and he makes it very plain. Just like some verses we read in the Bible, they're pretty plain. Don't need anybody to do an exegesis or an expound on that in any way. We got that. But some things are not so plain. Some things we don't understand. And we have to have him to explain that to us. And sometimes it feels like he's not speaking at all. I think we've all experienced that. But the truth is, he is speaking, I'm just not on the right frequency. How do I get to that frequency? If I don't hear, then I'm not in the right place. And if I don't understand, then it's not fine-tuned. So how do we do that? Well, I've got 4 steps that will kind of help us do that. The first thing is, it kind of ties in with our first concept, is we have to prepare ourselves to hear God. We've got to be prepared to hear God. If we are just spinning through our day like a whirlwind, we're going to miss God's voice. Even those of us who are very attuned to hearing his voice and very familiar with it, if our life is so busy that we're just blowing and going, we're going to miss it. We're not going to be able to connect with him. So in order for us to hear from God, we've got to prepare ourselves to hear from him daily by setting a time and a place where we purpose to meet him. The meeting with him has to be intentional. We got to bring our Bible and our notepad and our pen. We've got to show up with the expectation of, you're going to speak to me and I'm going to hear you and I'm going to write it down. So we got to turn off the noise. We got to tune out the world. There are times when God does kind of break through and we can hear him. If we're folding socks or scrubbing the tub, I call those, mindless activities that require a lot of concentration from me. But you know what? If I'm watching TV, I might not hear him. And so we as women have the ability to multitask. And so a lot of times we think that we can speak to God and have a very intimate moment with God while we're doing other things that require thought processes. You know what I'm saying? Now, I don't want to ever discount that, because I have been driving in the car and had a very intimate moment with God. I was balancing the checkbook when I heard God say something very distinct to me one time, made a promise to me. I have been folding laundry when the Lord said something to me, so I don't ever want to discount that. But that comes as a result of first having learned his voice in the intimate, quiet time when I shut out the world. When I came to the closet and shut the door, like Jesus said, for the purpose of getting alone with him. And so we've got to turn off the world, shut out the noise, and purpose to be alone with him. The time and the place are irrelevant. The time and the place are irrelevant. And I think we really need to understand that. When and where is of no consequence to God, as long as you're able to shut everything else out and tune in to his frequency. Now, I will say it's always a great idea to start your day off with God. That's the first thing. And the Bible talks a lot about being with him in the morning. And I think that's always good. But some of us aren't morning people. And some of us may be morning people, but we have to get up so crazy early for us to be alone, before the kids get up and the day starts rolling, that it's not really practical. So what I recommend there is what I do is my very first thoughts are dedicated to God. Sometimes I wake up and there's a song in my head that's him singing over me. And I tune into that. What are you saying to me? Or sometimes the song in my head is something to him. He's been singing over me during the night. And now my spirit is responding to him. So what's happening? Let me connect with that. And then, Lord, I just give you the day. Every part of it. You know what's happening. I don't. I've got plans, but they're in your hands. I give all of this to you. And whatever that looks like, as my mind is trying to wake up and pull the cobwebs of sleep away, But my time with God comes after my brain has managed to reboot itself, which is usually 2 or 3 hours after I first open my eyes. So if your time is in the morning, wonderful. But if it's not, there's no condemnation, there's no judgment, there's no pressure. Give those first few mornings, first few moments to him, but then make an appointment with God and keep it. Make an appointment with God and keep it. Determine in your mind it's unmovable. It doesn't matter what happens unless somebody's bleeding or the house is burning down. Me and Jesus are getting together right now. And everything else can wait. Everything else will wait. So if you're not a morning person, find a time. Find a place that works for you. Find the place where you're not going to be interrupted. Now, I can hear what a lot of you are thinking right now, because you think a lot of what I have thought in the past, and that is, okay, yeah, like where, when, because I'm never alone, especially when our kids are little. We feel like we got a kid that's suctioned to us all the time. I work so many hours. I'm so busy. I have so many commitments. I have so many responsibilities. There's all this thing. I'm really tired. I'm just a tired person, and I just can't pull my thoughts together. And so I don't know when this would happen, and I don't know where this would happen. But I heard Bill Hybels once say that we will make time for anything that is important to us. And I promise y'all, I make time to eat 3 times a day. I make time to sit down and be with my husband and talk with him. We make time for whatever we want to make time for. There's nothing wrong with watching TV. But if you make time to watch your favorite show, then you have time to spend with God. And all the things that we say, all the excuses that we make will hold absolutely no water when we stand before him. We make time for what we want to. And so I know we're busy. We got busy lives. We've got kids and husbands and jobs and families and homes to keep and errands to run and checkbooks to balance and all those things that have to happen in order for life to keep running and running smoothly. However, setting aside a time for God every day is the most important thing you will ever do on any given day. I don't care what else is happening. That is the most important thing that you could ever do. For you as an individual and for your family. Your children will do what you do. And if they don't see you spending time with God, they won't understand the necessity of spending time with God. You're mimicking for them what they need to live out. You're establishing that role model for them. It is crucial. And it makes me think of the story of Susanna Wesley, who was the mother of John and Charles Wesley. John Wesley was a pastor and theologian in the 1700s, and he is the founder of the Methodist movement of what today the Methodist Church is. And Susanna was his mother, and she had 19 children. And she started having children in the late 1600s and on through into the 1700s. And in that era, they didn't have all the modern day conveniences that we have. No dishwashers, no vacuum cleaners, no washing machines, no dryers. So, she's caring for 19 children, doing all of that work to keep her house running, plus sewing clothes, plus mending, plus I don't know what all, making butter and bread, and wow, I'm tired. She's doing every bit of that stuff by herself. Plus, in that era, there weren't schoolhouses. So she also schooled all of her children. 19 children she schooled. Y'all can't tell me you're that busy. You know what I'm saying? This woman was busy. And do what? No grocery store. No grocery store. And none of the modern conveniences that we have to help entertain our children, like preschool or daycare or television or the park. So she constantly had her children underneath her feet everywhere she went. But she was very intentional about spending time with God. She was very purposeful about that. And what she did was, when it was time to be alone with God every day, she sat at the kitchen table and pulled her apron up over her head and trained her children, Mama's with Jesus, and y'all better not bother me unless something tragic, like the house is on fire. You leave me alone. And they honored that because she was consistent every day at the kitchen table with the apron over her head. She was a pastor's wife also. I forgot to throw that in. You know, and so she understood the necessity of having an intimate, personal relationship with Jesus, where she talked to him and he talked to her. And as she did that day in, day out, she modeled for her children what a real dynamic relationship with God would look like, and raised two of the greatest men of God that the world ever knew, who to this day are still impacting. And while I appreciate John and Charles Wesley, it's their mama who did it. Because she showed them, this is how you live. And she did it day after day after day. And so maybe your time with God is at the kitchen table with the apron pulled over your head. I don't know. Maybe it's at the park or by the lake or in your bedroom or at the library. Maybe you're a person who likes a lot of variety, and so every day it's somewhere different. Maybe the time has to fluctuate depending on doctor's appointments or work schedules. None of that matters. Look at your schedule and determine, this is the time, this is the place, and nothing is going to get in the way of that. You know, my personal testimony with that is, in 2000, Stephen started first grade, and I started back to work full time. And in that time, prior to going to work, you know, being a stay-at-home mom, I could just pray whenever I wanted to pray. Oh, it's nap time, I'll pray. Oh, it's whatever, or here, you know, I could just, at my leisure, do that. But when I started to work, all of that changed because I'm getting up crazy early to get everybody else out the door, then to get to where I needed to be by 8 o'clock. And I worked till 5, and then y'all know the story after that. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, Lord, this isn't working out. And I don't know what I'm going to do, and I don't know how to incorporate all of this. And the Lord showed me, you have a lunch hour, don't you? I do. So there was a cemetery right down the street from where I worked. And every day at my lunch, I drove to the cemetery, parked underneath the tree. It's very quiet there. You don't get a lot of disruptions. Rolled down the windows and had my time with Jesus. And for a season in my life, Jesus and I met in the cemetery because that's what worked for me. And Jesus met me there. Look, he doesn't care when or where. He just wants to meet with you. But keep in mind, if it's not the first thing you do in the day, your day will slip away from you and you'll miss your appointment. Set your appointment and keep it. Number 2, once you've prepared to hear from God by scheduling time to be with him, the next step is to simply be still and worship. Go to Psalm 46:10. Very simple. Be still and know that I am God. The Hebrew words be still can also be translated as let go or relax. We will never hear God's voice if we don't quiet our mind and let go of all the thoughts that are tumbling around in our brain. And as women, our brains never stop, do they? Thank goodness for sleep. That's the only way we get a reprieve. Our brains are constantly moving, constantly going, because everything is connected to everything. Y'all ever been thinking about something and then the next thing you go, how did I even get over here to think about that? Then you have to follow the trail back, and sure enough, it all connected to that original thought, because our brains are constantly whirling and going. We are thinking about what needs to be done next. We are rearranging our schedules and our to-do list. We're planning for tomorrow. We're trying to set mental reminders. All this stuff is whirling around in our head. But if we're going to hear from God, then we have to learn to discipline ourselves, to quiet our mind and just be still. And to me, this is probably the toughest part of the entire process, is just being still. And I find sometimes that if my mind is just whirling 900 miles an hour, and I've got all this stuff tumbling around in my head, I just have to say, Jesus, here's all my thoughts. Will you hang on to them so that we can talk for a little bit? And then when we're done, I'll just take them back. Whatever part you want to give me back. You know? I just trust you to keep them, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget some stuff. I'm afraid that I'm going to, not remember to do this or to do that. And if there's a nagging thought to get the dry cleaning that just will not get out of my head, I just pull up my pen and paper and write, get dry cleaning. There it is. It's on the paper. Now I don't have to think about it anymore. It's out of my head. We've got to do whatever we need to do in order to rein our mind in and still our thoughts and be quiet. But you got to remember, just because you brought a pen and paper doesn't mean it's time for you to have a planning session or get your to-do list finished, okay? Got to be disciplined. If you're getting that thought out of your head, then the thought's out of your head and you're done with it. Turn the page so you have your new page, and we'll get to what we do with that later. Learn to be at rest. And then, once your mind has gotten still or quiet, slip into worship. Go to James 4:8. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Now, hang on to that thought. And then I'm just going to read to you, because we're getting late on time, so I'll just read to you Psalm 22:3, if you want to write that down. Yet you being God, are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Now, hang on to those thoughts, because we're going to tie those in here for a second. But when I say slip into worship, a lot of us are confused about worship, what worship is, and we think that worship is the musical prelude prior to the message on Sunday. But that is not the totality of worship. That is an expression of worship, but it is not in and of itself worship. Instead, worship is the daily invitation for God's kingdom to invade earth. And what are you? We've talked about this before. What are you? Your earth. Let your kingdom come in earth. What are you made of? Earth. You're a sack of dirt. That's what you are. It's true. So it's an invitation for his kingdom to come into earth. For everything that he is to come and fill your sack of dirt. We are humbling ourselves before him, surrendering ourselves to him, acknowledging that he is absolutely everything. Worship is the movement of our soul towards God. Worship is the setting aside of our humanity and solely putting our attention completely and totally on God. And what did we just read in James chapter 4? If I come close to him, then he comes close to me, right? And what did I just read to you in Psalm 22? That he's enthroned upon the praises of his people, right? So if I am worshiping him, I am creating a place for him to come and inhabit. Now, he's already in you. The totality of who he is lives inside of you. But something happens when we worship we peel back some layers of our humanity, and our spirit connects with him in a way that we can actually feel and sense. Worship is a shifting from the human to the supernatural. And it can involve music, or it doesn't have to involve music. The more we worship, the more aware we become of him. The bigger he gets in our mind and in our heart. The greater he is to us. The more we worship. It doesn't have to be elaborate and complicated. You don't have to have musicians. You don't have to have somebody leading you in singing. You don't even have to sing. If you want to, go ahead. But it doesn't have to be that at all. Worship can simply be a declaration of your affection for him. You telling him how absolutely wonderful he is. Of you just acknowledging who he is, his characteristics. He's omnipresent. He is omniscient. He's omnipotent. He is immutable. He is transcendent. He is eternal. Thinking about all of those things that blow our mind, the more we delve into that. That is worship. Proclaim how great he is. Take the psalm, find a psalm that's a worship psalm, and read it to him. Nothing's more powerful or expressed any better than the Word of God. Say the Word back to him. Sometimes I get into Job chapter 38 and 39, and I begin to read to him how amazing he is, that he's the one that puts the waters where they are and says how far they can go, and he knows where the storehouses for snow and hail are, and he knows where the sun makes its bed and where the moon lives, and he knows the home of the east wind. That's pretty amazing. And I begin to read that to him. That's worship. That's worship. We think of worship as being kind of complicated or difficult or convoluted, or I don't even know, this stinks because there's not even any music here. That's not what it's about. It's an expression of his greatness from the depths of your heart. Letting him know what you think and how you feel, and how much you love him and you appreciate him and who he is and his faithfulness. So express your heart. Express your deepest feelings. Sing it. Say it. Write it. You can write your prayers. They don't have to be spoken. I went through a season in my life where I stopped going to the cemetery, and then I got an office with a door, and so my lunchtime was with the door shut and a notepad, and I wrote. I wrote every prayer out. Everything, all my worship, all of my supplication, all of my thanksgiving, it was all written out. Because if somebody busted up in my office, it wasn't weird. And God's okay with that. He doesn't mind if you write it. You do what works for you. Because, look, God's going to communicate the way God's going to communicate. We're not going to put him in a box. Nor is he putting you in a box. Communicate to him the way that you best communicate. And then from there, do we have time to go on to the next thing? Well, we got a little bit. From there, just start to talk. You've quieted your soul. You've slipped into worship, and then just begin to talk to him and read the Bible. Psalm 119, 147, I'll read it to you. It says, I rise early before the sun is up. I cry out for help and put my hope in your words. The psalmist is telling us, okay, look, I have my quiet time with God before the sun comes up. It's pre-dawn. And then I pray. I cry out to God. And then I meditate on the Word. I get into the Word. He's saying, I put my hope in your words. And you can do the same thing. God's not looking for a list that you got to cover every single day. I used to think that. And I just felt so burdened and pressured to pray for everything in the whole wide world, for my husband and my kids and their future and myself, and then my church, and then the local government and the state government, and then the American government and the president, and before I knew it, I had like a list this was this long. And I'm like, if I'm going to pray for all of this, it's going to take me 4 hours. And how would that even work? And I'm saying the same thing day after day after day after day, and I'm sure God was getting really bored with that because I was getting really bored with that. And God's like, that's not what prayer is all about. You pray what I put on your heart. You talk to me. I'll tell you what I want to talk about. And you'll know what he wants to talk about because that will be what's pressing on you in the moment. Your friend's on your heart. You come out of worship and you think about your friend. And you just start praying for her. You start talking to God about her. Your husband, your kids, your job. Every day it's different. I mean, do you and your husband or do you and your friend talk about this exact same thing every time you get together? No, you don't. I mean, Bill and I never get together and have an agenda unless we're going to talk about like our budget, or when the kids were younger about, we're getting together right now to discuss the next school year, and what they might need or whatever. But that's really very uncommon. For the most part, we just talk. Don't you? Isn't that how you interact with your friend? You just start talking about whatever you saw, whatever you last heard that made you laugh. What was bothering you, troubling you? This is my day. This is how my day went today. You're never going to believe this. And you're just real. And that's exactly how God wants to talk to you. After you slip out of, you're still in worship, but you slip from worship into your dialogue. What's weighing on you? What are you worried about? Let's definitely talk about that because worry is a sin. We need to get that out and give that to God. What needs do you have? What's going on in your life? Those are the things that God wants to talk to you about. Let go of your structured prayers. God is not interested in a rote prayer. A couple of years ago, we studied in here the Lord's Prayer. God is not interested in us coming to him every day to say, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And he's just like, no. That's the pattern. That's the pattern. Don't say those exact words to me every day. That's not what he wants to hear. He wants the intimate dynamics of a real relationship. And this is what's on my heart today. And this is what I'm going through, and this is how I feel, and this is what I'm concerned about or I'm afraid of. This is everything that's happening, and you just tell God all of those things. And then from there, read. Read wherever you are. Read wherever you are. Just open it up and start reading your section for the day. Read until he tells you to stop. Read until you feel like you had enough. And then meditate on that. And then, do we have time to go into that? Well, we got 3 minutes. Finally, stop and listen. Any good, healthy relationship has dialogue from both sides. Stop and listen and begin to write. That's what the notebook and the paper are for. Psalm 45:1 in the Message says, My heart burst its banks, spilling beauty and goodness. I pour it out in a poem to the king, shaping the river into words. What the psalmist is saying here is when I meet with God, my heart is overflowing and is so full of emotion, so full of thoughts that come from being in your presence, that the best thing I know to do is to just start putting it on paper. I just start writing it out. And then in 1 Chronicles 28:19, David is talking with Solomon. And David's heart has been to build the temple for his entire reign as king. But that wasn't God's plan, and he understood that. And so he's having a conversation with his son Solomon, who would be the next king, knowing that Solomon was going to be building the temple. And David is showing him the plans for the temple. And this verse says, all of these plans were written with the Lord guiding me. He helped me understand everything in the plans. In other words, I was spending time with God, and he began to tell me what he wanted his house to look like. And I began to write it down. And what I didn't understand, he gave me clarity, and I wrote the clarity out. Write it down. Words are pretty important, but the words of God are the most important. And I have learned the hard way, if I don't write it down, I will not remember it. And I have found great comfort and joy in going back to the things that I wrote down and seeing how God, oh, I forgot I even asked you for that. And then you did it. Or God, I forgot you said that to me, but look at this. Look at what you've done. I go back and read the words of God to me quite frequently because they encourage me, they strengthen me, they remind me of his promises. And then I stand on the verse that all the promises of God are yes and amen in Jesus Christ. He's faithful to watch over his word and perform it. So it's a good habit to start writing in your quiet time. So like I said earlier, if you like to write all your prayers. That's wonderful. And then you're already got the momentum going and you just keep writing as he begins to speak to you. But if you don't like to write, that's okay. But at least start to write during this time when he begins to speak to you. And look, it's not complicated. A lot of times we think that writing what God is saying to us or even hearing what God is saying to us is this big complicated thing, or it has to look a certain way or sound a certain way. But the truth is, it's very simple because, like I said earlier, we're sheep, right? We're pretty dumb. So he's keeping it simple for us. He's not putting anything out there that is very convoluted. So don't make it complicated. Write what comes to mind. Write what comes to mind. Do not overanalyze it, because you can analyze away the truth of God. You can reason away his voice, trying to make it make sense sometimes when it doesn't. And y'all know God doesn't always make sense to us, and our very shallow humanity. So don't overanalyze it. Write what comes to mind. Whatever you sense he is saying to you in the passages that you read, whatever you sense he's saying to you about those things that you lifted up to him, those things that were on your heart, that were weighing on you, that were troubling you, that you were thinking about, even things that you were very excited about, and things that he did for you, and you're talking to him about, I'm so thankful how you came in and you did this and you did that and you were so wonderful. He may very well say something to you about that. It was my pleasure to take care of you, sweet girl. I always love to provide for you. Write those down. He'll speak those sweet nothings to your heart. He'll give you peace. He'll give you instruction. He'll give you direction. He will speak to you, and as you write it down, you'll find things just start flowing out of your hand that you didn't even really realize. He'll start whispering all of that to your heart. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you're going to become in doing it. And the first time you write, it might only be one word. It might be one phrase. It might not even be a complete sentence. That's okay. The more you do it, the more fluent you will become in it. And the more there will be, until you find, oh my goodness, page after page after page. He's just downloading so many wonderful things, giving me insight, giving me wisdom, giving me direction, giving me the steps to take, telling me what to do in every area of your life. And the great thing about all of this is these steps work for absolutely everybody. Whether you're a brand new believer or you've been walking with the Lord for 50 years, these steps work for everybody. Whether you're just now learning to hear God's voice or you do hear God's voice very plainly and clearly and you recognize it, these steps work for you. And they grow with you as your relationship with God grows. So if you're new at this, give him 15 minutes. 5 minutes to quiet your mind and worship. 5 minutes to just talk about what's on your heart and read the word. 5 minutes to write down what you hear. We can do that, can't we? 15 minutes. And as you grow in that relationship with him, your time can grow. Everybody has got 15 minutes. But the cool thing about it is, as I connect with him and I begin to hear his voice and I begin to hear him say things to me, that changes the whole dynamic of the relationship. And it's not just me saying the same thing over and over again, which is boring, which means I have to just practically poke my eye to make me go pray. Because it's so painful I can't wait to go sit and talk with God because I don't know what he's going to say today. Or I've got to have a word about this. I need to know what's going on in this, and he'll tell me. He'll give me insight. He'll give me direction. He will point me in the right way. Or I am so depressed, or I am discouraged, or I feel defeated, and if I can just get into his presence, he will whisper something to my ear that will lift my spirit and encourage me and take me to the next place. That's what transforms the relationship, is hearing his voice. Otherwise, it's just very mechanical and robotic, and nobody wants to do that. It takes us to vibrancy, from I have to do this, because jeepers, I want to go to heaven, to I get to do this.